Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. So, what we want to do now is we want to create a services for the card because at the end of the day we want to be able to store items in the card. So to do that, we want to head into our app folder, and inside the app folder we're going to create a folder called services. And inside services we're going to create a card manager. And we want to namespace this under app services. You want to create a class called card manager. And then in this we want to create a couple of functions. So let's just start out with outlining the basic. So we want to have a protected card. We want to have a public function called add. We want to have a public function called remove. We want to have a public function which is called update. You want to have a public function which is called get subtotal, and we want to have a function called get card. So these are the functions we want for now. We're gonna continuously add more things into it. This is gonna be quite a big class. So we want to also make sure that we have essentially a contract for this. Let's create a contract called card manager, or we can just create the folder maybe for now. Then go in here, we will essentially create PHP class, and it's going to be an interface, and we're going to call this card manager. There we go. And I'm just going to start out with adding in all of these functions here into the card manager, and we're just going to get rid of all of these brackets here. And with that done, we now have these functions. We now want to say implements card manager. And we want to just say use app services contracts card manager. And we want to extend it, of course, not implement. And we want to call this as card interface. There we go. And a lot of the time we want to we also want to make sure we have some more functions in here, but for now that's gonna be fine. And it is actually implement, so it's just because PHP Storm is getting itself confused. Yeah, so we're implementing this contract here, and in here we want to add various different functions. So to get started with, we want to create a constructor. In this constructor, we just want to have this card set. So what we can do is we can actually just say protected card. There we go. So now we have this constructor here where we have this card, and we can then access this anywhere. All right, so with that done, we now want to go ahead and create a card instance before we do anything else. Now, before we go into how we're going to use this exactly, we have to redo some of this code here. So basically what we need to do is we need to say this is nullable because you may be a guest, you may not be a user that's signed in. In card items, we want to have this as a constraint. But first we want to call this a foreign ID. And we want to constrain this. So what we basically want to say is we want to constrain this to the products variation. We want to cascade on delete, just like we did beforehand. And basically that's how we identify the items. So let's head back into the migrations one here. So inside the migrations, let's remove these two. Let's also make sure we delete cards and cards items. So this works properly. You probably will need to delete the card items first and then the cards. There we go. And let's head back into our terminal. Let's say PHP artisan migrate. Perfect. All right, let's close that down. Let's just close all our things in here. And that's perfect. So now we have the ability to relate those to each other. As you can see, we have all of that now. It's possible to store as nullable. So to get started with inside this card model, we want to go in and we want to create a function called get or create card. And this should actually be a protected function. And instead of doing it this way now, we actually want to go back and say protected card, because then we can call this card using in here this get or create card. Perfect. So we now have this function. The moment it will be complaining because it's not returning anything, so let's just return card for now. That will break. So what we want to check here is we want to use a session. In this case, you want to use this facade session. We want to get card ID, and then if card ID, so if this exists, in that case we want to go in and say card, which we'll set up here as null by default. In this case we want to say card equals card, and we want to basically say first or new pass through the card ID as card ID. And I'm sorry, we need to not use a comma here. We just need to define it like that. Perfect. And then if we are authenticated and is null for the card, in this case user ID, we want to go ahead in here and say card user ID equals of ID card save, and that will essentially go ahead and say if we have this session with the card ID, we'll then go ahead and find it, or we could also, instead of saying first and new, we could just say where. That may be a better approach for this. So instead, just say where card ID equals card ID. Then grab the first one, and then down here, we could essentially put this actually all the way down here, and then say if card ID doesn't exist instead. Or it may actually be easier to just put it in here instead. Yeah, let's put it in here, sorry. Just create an else condition here, and in here let's just say card equals card create. So we want to create a new card, and then we want to say card ID is equal to str UUID, and use ID is the same as of ID. But we obviously want to make sure that that's only if that exists. And then in the case that we don't have a new card, we want to store session where we put in the card ID as card ID. And in this case, we want to return an instance we want to return mixed here because we're returning basically essentially what we're returning is a card model, but we'll just leave that for now and work on that later on, otherwise this video is going to get too long. So now we want to go ahead and test this. So how do we test this? Let's go to the web.php, into the home controller, and in here we want to die dump on new card manager, see what we get. A temporary property, card ID, oh no, that's because we're calling it on card ID, of course, not the card. So now we have a model here. So if you go back into the database, just create one here. Let's just make sure we only create one. Perfect. And let's just comment that out for now. So we're not logged in, so let's just log in. Perfect. Okay, so in that case, let's see what happens if we now try Domino again. We created a new card instance. So what we actually want to do instead is we don't want to create a new one. We want to be able to just swap between them when you, for example, log in and log out. So what's going wrong here? Let's create a new card instance, just like that, and then let's die dump on card ID. It's null. So somehow this is not stored when we created this. Yes, so why is that? Let's figure that out now. So let's try out instead to add in a session manager like this. Perfect. And here let's just say new session manager. That's fine. All right, so inside the session manager, let's say, instead of saying session get, we just want to say this session manager get card ID. And then we just want to say inside here, instead say this session manager get, and we want to say, especially in this case, we want to say this card equals, because we just want to store this here. And we don't want to say get, so we want to say put card ID as card ID. Let's refresh. So we say this card equals this session manager put. Actually, we don't want to say that. We want to say, we just want to use put here in this case, because we want to have a get function afterwards instead. So inside home controller line 18, what is expected? That is not needed. So in here, what do we want to pass in? In the session manager, we have a container that's passed in. But instead, what we can do is we can, so instead of using like that, we can just say ed app, which will then pass through the card manager class. If you head back in, refresh, you can see we have a session ID here. So in this case, let's just dive dump on card ID, see if it's stored now. It's still not. So what if we dive dump? Why is that null? Let's figure that out. The last thing we want to do obviously as well is save the session. So let's go ahead and save it. I have also gone ahead and made sure that we now just pass through session manager and use protected session here instead, and then get the session manager's driver. So if I go ahead, I refresh. Now I go ahead, you can see we have two instances here, but if I go again, I create a new one. We got attempt to read property use ID on null. So why is that happening? Where is that happening? That's because we still have the session there. So let's just say this session, forget card ID, because it thinks the card ID exists now, but it doesn't, because we just deleted it. Alright, that's fine. So now we have a card ID here. Let's refresh. How many have we got? One. Perfect. So now if I go in here and I just want to uncomment that for now. I want to log out. I want to re-enable this. Perfect. I now want to go and disable that. I want to log in. Perfect. And I then want to go ahead and get the session again. What's happened? It's now just set the user ID. So now you can log in. You can do it as logged in or as logged out. It will automatically already know the user ID. So even if you log out now, it will still know that's associated with that user. So with that done, we now have the ability to retrieve the card session. This is quite a long video, and I'm sorry for the length of it. So I'm gonna end it here, and in the next video we're gonna add items to the card now that we're able to retrieve it successfully anywhere in the application without any problem. So thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.